Now, while I don't have that specific camera, I have the closest match to it. This beautiful camera here. This is the Konica T3 camera. The TC was made in 1976 to 1978, but this one was made in 1973. And they actually have very similar features, which I will go through. The TC, the one you're interested in, is actually a really good camera. I would say it's a really good, solid beginner camera. Because it's so similar to this one, I will use this one as a stand-in. The TC has auto exposure lock. That means that you can use this little button here to actually set your exposure and to be able to lock it before you shoot. The reason is that, for example, if you're in a backlit situation where you have a subject with a bright background, you can use this to basically get close to your subject, set your exposure. Your metering is center metering, so you use this to set your exposure for the subject. Then you can come back and compose your image, and then it will keep that setting while you have this depressed, right? And that way you get a proper exposure. You expose for your subject and not the background. So that's auto exposure lock. The TC has it. The T3 also has it. Another feature that it has is a self timer between 4 seconds and 10 seconds. So it's a variable self timer. That's actually not very common with a lot of film cameras. That particular camera has it. So I would say that's actually a really good feature. It doesn't have a mirror lockup feature, which is usually reserved for like a bit more professional cameras. And what is the mirror lockup feature? You use that in situations where you don't want your mirror, because it's a reflex camera, you know, the mirror in there, when you fire your shot, if your shutter speed is so slow, it can actually cause a blur, that little shake that the mirror that it gives, because it has to flip up to allow the light in when you fire, when you actually expose your image. That little shake can cause a blur. So the mirror lockup feature is meant to, you lock the mirror up after you've done your metering, and then when you shoot, it doesn't shake because the mirror is already up, right? So it doesn't shake, and that actually gives a sharper image. It doesn't have that, but you will not need a feature like that if you're shooting in normal settings where you have sufficient light. What both the TC and the T3, this one, what feature they have is shutter priority mode. So that means that you set your shutter. What you actually have here is when you set your lens here to the AE position, you see that green position there? When I set it to the AE position, it locks it in place. And that AE position allows you to shoot in the auto exposure mode. And the auto exposure mode for the TC and the T3 is shutter priority mode, right? So shutter priority mode means that you set the shutter, which you want, and then the camera determines the aperture. But the good thing is that the camera also allows you to shoot manually, right? So when you move this out of that AE mode, which you do by pressing this button here, and once you press that button, you're able to slide this out of there. Then you're able to set your aperture here on the lens, and then you set your shutter speed here. So you're shooting in a manual mode, and the manual mode is very powerful because then you get to determine which aperture you want, which shutter speed you want. Now both cameras shoot up to 1/1000th of a second, and this particular one will shoot from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. The TC, on the other hand, will shoot from 1/8 of a second to 1/1000th of a second. So you have some range there. In terms of ISO, for the TC, you can go from 25 ISO 25 to ISO 1600, whereas this one can go from ISO 12 or ASA 12 to ISO 3200. But that's enough range. I mean, most film that you will purchase would be what, ISO 100, ISO 200, maybe ISO 400 if you're shooting in darker settings. You barely go that high, right, for the modern film that is available. So I think in conclusion, the TC is a really, really good camera. I think if you're thinking about getting it, you should probably get it. You will find it to be very awesome and really nice to shoot with, and go for it. That would be my recommendation.